Hi, I'm Simon Drew, and you're listening to the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to find more episodes of the show, as well as articles and information about my one-on-one alignment coaching, then you can head to my website. It's simonjedrew.com. If you do have the means to support the show, then I'd love to see you in my Patreon community. Just go to patreon.com/SimonJEDrew, where you'll also get access to over 240 episodes recorded before 2020. But for now, enjoy the show. Hey everyone, thank you so much for spending your time with me here on the podcast today, and we've got a couple of great guests for you. And Kai Whiting is back on, and obviously we all love Kai. He always recommends an excellent guest for the show, and also we have alongside Kai Aldo Dinucci, who has never been on the show. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. So Aldo Dinucci, he is a doctor in ancient philosophy, and he has published the first translation of Epictetus's Discourses, Book 1, in Portuguese, among other works. He is the founder of the Brazilian Epictetus Portuguese, a group of researchers and followers of Epictetus in Brazil. So when Kai recommended Aldo to come on the show, Kai said to me, listen, Aldo is Stoicism in South America. He is Stoicism in Brazil. And because he literally introduced, Epictetus's works to Portuguese-speaking people. And so he's really got such a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of wisdom, and he shares that with us on the episode today, talking mostly about Stoic communitarianism and how there's cultural differences around the world in how people kind of pick up Stoicism, how they interpret it. And it was just a wonderful conversation, and a good friend of Kai's, and now I hope to consider him as a good friend of mine as well. So I hope that you enjoy this episode with Kai Whiting and Aldo Dinucci. Kai and Aldo here. Guys, thank you so much for being here in the first place. Aldo, I'm particularly excited, obviously, to chat with you about everything that you're doing for the South American portion of Stoicism, right? And but as is usual, whenever you, Kai, recommend an excellent guest to come on the show, I'm going to start with you. I want you to tell myself and the audience, why did you say that we have to get Aldo on the show? What was it about Aldo and his work that excited you so much? And then Aldo, I'll bring you in and you can kind of give your own little summary of who you are, what you do, and why you're into Stoicism at the moment.
Well, I'm Aldo Dinucci. I'm professor of ancient philosophy at the Federal University of Sergipe, Brazil. And I'm also the editor-in-chief of Prometheus, a Brazilian journal of philosophy, and I have published, among other books, translations from Greek to Portuguese of the Manual of Epictetus and Epictetus Discourse. Actually, I started to research Epictetus 20 years ago, and I was reading French translation of the Enchiridion of the Manual, and I realized that we had no translation available in Portuguese of it. And I started to translate it from Greek to Portuguese 20 years ago. And I published it at the first time in 2007, the first edition of my translation. And then Alfredo Julien, a professor here of ancient history here where I live, we made a second translation, bilingual translation of the manual, and we published it at Coimbra Press in Portugal. It's a very important press to Portuguese speakers. And now we have this translation available for everyone who speaks Portuguese in the face of earth, because the press, the Coimbra Press, makes this translation available for everybody in PDF form. And last year, and or in the beginning of this year, I published also the first translation ever of Epictetus Discourses, Book 1, also by Coimbra Press, and it is available in PDF form for free for everybody. So in the first time, we have this material available for everybody. And as Kay said, it's not an easy task to translate it from Greek. It's a very difficult task, especially when you don't have any other translation available in your language. One thing is when you read something in another language, as in English, as French, or the very different thing is when you put it in your own language. So some 5 years ago, I had the idea of making a meeting here where I live, calling all the Brazilians who study Epictetus, and then some of them come to Sergipe. You know, Brazil is a very big country. It's like Australia. It's a continental country. And they came, something about 10 people came here, and he had the idea of founding the Portuguese of Epictetus. And now it's working since 2016. And we have both people working with translation, as me, people doing research, academic research, and people doing contemporary Stoicism, which is, I think is very important also.
Yeah. And what's so exciting about what you're doing, Aldo, is it's such a pioneering task, right? Like to be the first person to kind of translate Epictetus into Portuguese is brilliant. I mean, I don't know if you've run the numbers, but like how many more people in the world does that open up the words of Epictetus to? What's that population like? And Kai, I want to bring you in here for a moment. Kai, you obviously, as I said at the start of the episode, you recommended Aldo to come on the show. What is it about Aldo's work and what he's doing that inspires you so much? And you also wanted to delve into a little bit of the cultural side of the translations as well. I want you to kind of ask the first question, if you will, because I know that was an interesting way to go down.
I think, well, I first became aware of the problem that Aldo is attempting to solve because I was not running, but I was helping or co-running a Stoa here in Lisbon. And I refused to speak in English actually during our meeting. We only spoke in Portuguese. So I've been a bit out of practice because unfortunately the group really folded. Part of the problem was that we had no primaries. So I could rock down to a library and try to find something. And there was really nothing in Portuguese about Marcus Aurelius, for example, really nothing of quality. I mean, you might get the odd translation and you'd be like, I'm not really sure how good this translation is. And it's kind of like, I feel it's like the kind of thing that you had when you were, say, Muslim back in the day, like 1850s. You'd have text that Christians translated, but you wouldn't have a text that a Muslim actually translated. So you have like Pickfall, and he suddenly translates the Quran into English as a Muslim. That's a fundamental difference. When you have somebody who's really into this, and really understands it and translates, that's a completely different thing to somebody who happens to speak. And it's still excellent skill. It happens to speak, let's say, or read ancient Greek and then writes Portuguese as a native. If they don't have a Stoic background, then they're going to see it through a lens that maybe isn't always helpful. Well, that's still good. We should have some translations, perhaps, by people that do that. But I think that in English, you've got people like Chris Gill who check the translations, who really, Professor Christopher Gill, who check translations and make sure that yes, this is in line with Stoic thought. So we had a massive problem. We just had no text with which to have a discussion. As I could get an English text and we could read it in English because in Lisbon, a lot of people at least speak enough English to do that, to have this conversation. But the inability to think in one's own language stops them being able to apply Stoicism in their own language. And it became a very academic endeavor because they were always having to think in English to discuss Epictetus. And it's like, okay, well, what do you do when you're at home and you want, you really want to seek Stoic wisdom, and everything you have in your head is in a different language. And that's problematic. So when I found out that Aldo was doing this work, I was like, I needed you. I needed to know of you before we folded, because we folded in part because it was very difficult to attract new people interested in Stoicism. When they go, well, what can we do? I can't even get the book in the library. I can't get the book in the... There's nowhere I can go to get this information. Therefore, it's not useful to me. And I'm not an academic person. And the kind of concepts that you're talking about, they don't make sense to me, because even your contemporary Stoic framework is still very much an Anglo-Saxon one. You're still thinking with the mindset of an English speaker, which of course I was, because I was, for one, I am an English speaker natively, but also because I was writing in English. So when I don't write in Portuguese very often at all, but I was writing academic material, for example, in Spanish. And so the way I was thinking about, in this case, mineral resources, was completely different. The cultural context I was using was different. So the way I wrote was different, because when I think about expressions and then what it means to people, like a particular word, what it means, completely different understanding to if I could translate that into English. So this was really problematic. And I found that Aldo was doing this work, and I was like, wow, this is pioneering. Whatever I might do in the environmental field, okay, that's pioneering in one aspect, but I'm taking Stoicism into areas that haven't really considered Stoic application, but this is so much bigger. To take it to, like you were asking, there's 200 million Brazilians, there's 10 million Portuguese. So we're talking at least, I reckon 250, 300 million people suddenly being able to access Stoic primaries. But more importantly, Aldo didn't really say this, but his community is also translating my texts, Donald Robertson's texts, transcripts, so that people aren't just thinking about the primaries, but really about the application of Stoicism in a contemporary context. And that's a lot of work. That is a fundamental amount of work, and there's not a lot of credit. There's not a lot of credibility. You can't sit there and say, yes, I know Kai wrote like 5 papers, but I translated 150. In academia, that doesn't even count for anything. I mean, and we need to, and that's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And I thought, no, we need to celebrate Aldo's, not just Aldo, but Aldo and his team's work, because it's a lot of work that goes beyond just writing the odd paper here and there. So I was really excited, because it is like being a pioneer on the ground. It is doing something which is fundamentally important. It's opening people's eyes and ears to Stoicism in a time, for COVID and the unrest, I'm not going to go into it, but the unrest that you feel in, that I am aware of in Brazil. You're opening people to an alternative way of looking at the world. Like, you don't have to panic. You just have to have a good framing. And I think Stoicism is not the framing, but certainly one that you could use. So for me, it was like, we need to celebrate Aldo, and we need to show other people that in their country, for example, they're Latvian, and they want to have Stoicism in their country, perhaps they could contact Aldo, and Aldo could explain, like, these were the challenges that we had. So I think my question to Aldo would be, what was the biggest emotional challenge for you to have on your shoulders? Because I know that you do have on your shoulders, like, at least 200 million Brazilians who, if you don't do your job, don't even hear about Stoicism. That was my question. So what is the emotional pressure that you feel when you're taking a whole country on your back and your team? I know you're spreading it out, and without you doing your work or directing the work that is done, these people don't have access to Marcus Aurelius, for example.
Well, in the beginning, the first thing I thought is that after reading the manual of Epictetus, I thought that it should be in Portuguese, because it helped me so much. I read it in a moment when I was in need of this, It existentially speaking, it was very important for me. It helped me a lot in that moment, 20 years ago. And I thought to myself, it should be in Portuguese, available for everyone. So my first idea was this. So let me show you the editions. So in 2007, we published this small edition. It's a very small one, it's old by now. It's a dissemination edition, you know. There is a popular introduction to everyone who wants to know Epictetus. It's academic by one side, because I'm academic. I have a doctoral degree on philosophy, but I made it for dissemination purpose.
That's so awesome.
This preoccupation of making this material available for everyone in Brazil, both in physical format and both in PDF also. And by now, I made it. It's a reality by now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for showing all that, Aldo. Seriously, this is and 50,000 people getting access to those works. It's like literally life-changing literature right there, going out to people who need it. And that's so awesome. I want to ask a couple of things. So firstly, sticking to the kind of, I guess, the cultural shift of bringing something like, Epictetus to the Portuguese language. And you're obviously talking with a lot of people who are taking on a lot of these principles, reading these works. What do you find are some of the, I guess you could say, the challenges or opportunities of merging the cultures of, say, ancient Western philosophy and, South American culture? Do you find that people really take it on quite easily? Are there any cultural divides that kind of, get in the way of living a Stoic life? Or is it a pretty seamless integration?
It's a very interesting question. We created our group in Brazil without knowing what was happening in Europe about the new Stoicism and everything. Just in the last few years, I started to contact you in Europe and North America, and we realized that there is a great difference between your approach, of Stoicism, and ours. We realized that in Europe, both in Europe and in the United States, the approach is very individualistic, And in Brazil, it was, since the beginning, communitarian for some reason. I don't know why exactly. So our approach is communitarian from the beginning.
Yeah.
It's something that is missing. We talk, me and Kai talk a lot about this. Something that is missing in European Stoicism.
Yes.
Virtues
Okay.
always have a social aspect. Epictetus says this when he talks about Zeus, that when Zeus is the rainmaker, to be the rainmaker, he at the same time he helps people. He helps people sending rain to the world. So for the Stoics, virtues are at the same time social and individual.
Yeah, this is really interesting to me, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. This idea of, okay, you can't just chuck the idea out to humanity and say act virtuously, because I mean, who knows what virtue is and how do you figure it out? And there's so many things that you could argue over. But so what you're saying is communitarianism is almost, could it be used as a framework to say virtue is what is good for the hive of humanity, the beehive of humanity, right? If it's good for other people, if it's good for me. But even then, I mean, when you start questioning, is it good for humanity? How do you get past the roadblocks there? Because there's so many arguments that you could have over if something is good for humanity or if it's not good for humanity. Like, this is a question that I want to throw out there to both of you. How do you judge a virtuous action over an action of vice? Like, how do you make that distinction, even when you are saying if it's good for humanity, it's good?
Do you want to talk a little, Kai? I think Kai could.
I think I emphasize the fact, and it's not just me, a lot of contemporary Stoics do so, and obviously the ancient Stoics do, that virtue cannot exist in a vacuum. I can't be just to myself. Now, I can on some very tiny level, right? So if I lived on a desert island, I could be just to myself. But I think that would be missing the point, because I even, as your listeners know, I added a circle, because the environment, not just what's good for humanity as a species, but as good for humanity as part of the bigger whole. So even if I'm on a desert island, I can't sit and burn it just because I'm, angry with the world that no helicopter has come and rescued me. Because in the end, if the helicopter does not come and rescue me, I'm now living on a burnt island. And I use that very specifically because of climate breakdown, we're literally burning the planet that we're on. So I would say it's extended, but yes, this is something that the Stoics traditionally didn't recognize, even though the environmental pollution was pretty high. If you look at the ice cores, it was just as high as just before the Industrial Revolution. So we had to go from ancient Roman period, the lead mining, to the Industrial Revolution to reach the same level of environmental challenges. So it's not something that they were completely oblivious to, but obviously the scope, the expanse of it is different. When I ask myself, okay, how do I know what's good? You get various viewpoints. This is why I think the traditional Stoic view of the Stoic God is very important as an objective yardstick that isn't part of me. So the Stoics would say, well, they would use a different answer. They'd say, well, it's the fragment of your soul that goes back to a conversation we had with Will Johncock. The fragment of your soul that corresponds to the fragment, to the logos, would show you what is right. So there is a sort of, it's different to Christianity, for example, because you inherently believe in Stoicism that humans are good. There is no original sin where we are inherently bad and we need God to rescue us in that sense. In the Stoics, it's like we are inherently good, and we need to connect ourselves with God so that we continue to be good. And then when we fail to do that, we are, as Marcus already said, cut off. We cut ourselves off from society, or the world in general. So then you say, okay, but how do I know what's good for humanity? How do I know that? So if I don't use it, this is the problem I have if you don't have a Stoic God, or at least the essence of a logos involved, because then I have a very sort of, what I think is good for Kai must be good for Aldo, because that should be good for Simon. And that's the problem, that if you remove this theology, you get into really shaky ground about what you think is good, because you're not, in a Stoic viewpoint, you're not corresponding to that fragment of the essence of the logos, which is not truth as such. It's more like rationality, which you can translate as truth, but it would have different connotations depending on who you talk to about what truth is. So they say, no, you are corresponding to what is rational. So, and then you would say, okay, so how does the mother know that what is good for her is good for the child, right? She instinctively, I would say in most cases, a mother or a father would instinctively know that feeding their child was good. I don't think many people would have to be told that, or have to have a legal framework to be like, if you don't feed your child, that's murder. I don't think most parents would ever have to kind of weigh that up. That's why I think that the research that Aldo's team are doing about how we can use this in a contemporary context is very important, because there are no answers if you don't understand theology. So we tend to, unfortunately, say things like Seneca said, that people are our guides, our teachers are not our guides, we can do whatever we want. That's not what he said. He says, once you have the groundwork done, once you understand the text that we're writing, once you really get a handle on Stoicism, then when you finally understand this, you can then recognize the difference between what is useful, as in what is really guiding, and what is teaching, but you can apply in a slightly different way. It doesn't mean literally how contemporary Stoics are taking it to be like, I can get rid of whatever I want because they're our teachers, not our guides. That's not what Seneca was saying at all. In fact, if you read the entire context of what he said, it was very clear. Once you have the groundwork, once you know what you're doing, once you recognize that the virtues don't exist in a vacuum, once you really understand the fragment of the fragment of your soul, the physical fragment, for Stoics is physical, the physical fragment of your soul, how it corresponds to the logos, and how that dictates how you should behave, then using that, and only after years of training can you then decide what you would reject for you personally and what you keep. And this is the problem, that we suddenly go into Stoicism and go, Seneca said I can get rid of everything. Yay! It's like a disclaimer, like I can do everything I want to do in Stoicism, but when I don't like it, I can change it because Seneca gave me permission. That's not what is being said. So yeah, that's a very difficult question. But how do I know what's good for society? I would say that I do believe that most human beings, if educated reasonably and rationally, are good. I honestly believe that. And obviously, the people that aren't behaving well, they believe they're rational, and then we need to have a dialogue. So the Stoics would say, how do you realize that something is good for a person and therefore good for humanity? Discussing it. So if you and I discuss that, and the idea is to discuss it not with a massive group, so we're not necessarily into democracy and Stoicism, but with a small enough group to be like, okay, what is the issue? Why should I behave or not behave in that way? And get this kind of feedback. But when you did that last week, you actually ruined my garden. When you decided to, I don't know, throw the water out of your bucket into my garden, it ruined my garden. That's not very pro-social. And then you say, okay, well, what can I do with the bucket of water? And then you might come to a conclusion together about where you should throw the bucket of water instead of on your neighbours in your neighbour's garden. And this is part of the problem, that if you don't communicate and collaborate in a way that brings people into the conversation because you're so interested in yourself, then you're unable, I really believe you are unable to determine what is good, because you're not doing that. What you're determining is what is good for you according to a very superficial understanding of Stoicism, because what you are, if you're being individualistic, you don't understand Stoicism. Like individualistic in a very selfish way, which does not take into consideration anybody else, you don't understand Stoicism. What you're practicing isn't Stoicism.
And this is something that I'd like to ask Aldo as well. It's like, it's pretty clear to see that, especially in America, there is a very individualistic element of Stoicism. Kai, we've already talked about, your term, Silicon Valley Stoicism. This just hyper, go lifestyle, get as much as I can, get as disciplined as I can, that sort of stuff. And there's not a lot of focus on the wider community. How can I improve that? Aldo, what is it about the South American culture, the Brazilian culture, that you think was so receptive to the communitarianism side of Stoicism? Why do you think from day one it just hit the ground running with a more community-oriented view of Stoicism?
Yeah, it's a very good question that we are trying to solve. We don't know exactly why, because we thought everyone in the world was approaching Stoicism in the same way as us, but it's different. I don't have an answer to this by now. What I know is that it came out spontaneously in our group. For instance, the first guy that noticed it was Carlos Enéas, who is a student of mine. He realized that there was something strange in the political action of some Roman Stoics, like Musonius, like Seneca, like Epictetus also, and he started to think about it. And I joined him in this research about this political status of the Stoics in Rome. And everything started here, from this point. And we started to develop this communitarian view, so to say, thinking about the political activity of the ancient Romans. And at the same time, we have here in Brazil a strong community of friends who study Epictetus and the Stoics. And this community sprung naturally. It was spontaneously, so to say. And so we have these two elements: a community that developed spontaneously, and reflection about the political action of the ancient Roman Stoics.
And I'd like to ask about that as well, because we are living in one of the most politically charged times in history, and obviously we're in the middle of I don't want to comment on what's going on in America at the moment, but just to say, through your research of the way that Epictetus and Musonius Rufus, these Roman Stoics, interacted with politics or thought about it, what do you think we can learn from them in order to be more effective in our, I guess, political, you might say, activism or political a desire to change things from the top down, even though that's not the approach we would take? But how did the ancient Stoics kind of view politics?
Yeah, a friend of us, Donato Ferrara, says that there is no place in the world where we need more Stoicism than in South America. And I know you suspect why. Because, of course, you know that we have a lot of political problems, a lot of social justice problems, and Stoicism has a lot of tools which will help us in this task of doing a better country for everyone. For instance, Musonius Rufus has a discourse where he says that instead of buying expensive things for your house, you should help people to get better education and to become better citizens. It's something that we miss a lot in Brazil. I know, of course, you know that in Europe, and in Australia, and in North America, a good education is basically available for everyone, at least in the first degrees. But it's not a reality here. Here in Brazil, they have very rich people living in castles, so to say, and people living in slums without education, without health system, without anything. So people in Brazil are not aware of this. These basic things that people are aware in Europe, in Australia, in North America, people in Brazil are not aware. So Stoicism can help us in Brazil in this task of making a better civilization, because people in Brazil just are not aware of basic points about what is a civilization. For instance, people threw garbage on the streets, opened the door of the car and threw garbage on the streets. They do it because they have no idea about the community, about what is a social action. For you, maybe that's why it's so different. In Europe, in Australia, in North America, you are aware of this. You know that's a bad thing to throw a paper or garbage on the street because you damage your community. But in Brazil, we don't have this conscience. We are not aware of this. It's strange. I know you think, how can it be? But it is as it is, unfortunately. And so, I don't know if it's the right expression. Stoicism has a civilizatory asset for us, utility for us.
Yeah. And I just think it's so wonderful that, you know, I just keep on thinking of like 50,000 people, like 50,000 people reading the words of Epictetus for the first time. You know, if you change one person's life and they go on to become a better person and to help their community more and to help their family and their country, it's like that does enough good for you to be satisfied with your efforts, right? But let alone 50,000 people in these countries where, like you say, a lot of people don't have that framework for understanding what is a good decision, what's a bad decision in terms of the community. And you know, it's just such a beautiful thing. I can't wait to see this, you know, continue to flourish throughout South America. But something that you wrote in, you pointed it out. You pointed out a quote from Epictetus, and you kind of discussed it in your article on modern Stoicism. This idea that the Stoics kind of separate the soul from the body, sort of thing. So the soul is kind of your portion of the divinity. And so there's, you know, you want to connect with that so that you can find out what's good for your soul. and you also want to be careful not to connect too much with the body, because that's kind of the animalistic side of things, right? And I think that there was a really great analogy there of being at a banquet. And so, for your body, it would be probably advantageous to take the larger portion of the meal and leave the rest for everyone else. But for the soul, the community, the people, it wouldn't be so advantageous. And so can you kind of talk to me a little bit more about, I guess, the way that Epictetus or Musonius Rufus talked about this, that kind of separation there, and how that can help people to make more virtuous decisions?
Oh, yeah, this is a very interesting point. By now, I'm studying an article of Anthony Long about this relationship between body and soul in Stoicism, which is not easy at all. It's a very sophisticated relation established. And basically, we can say that there are some passions that spring from the body. I will say our individual desires, so to say, your desire to eat, your desire for sex, your desire for money, your desire for pleasure in general. And these desires, they are not communitarian in origin. But your soul, or the rational part of it, the hegemonicon or the hegemonicon, yeah, it's both rational, ethical, and social. For the Stoics, these things coincide. These things coincide. You cannot be rational without being ethical and social. So you can balance your desires to the social needs you must face while living in a society. For as you said, when eating with someone else, we will not eat everything that is in front of you, because it's not. Even if you find pleasure, if your stomach finds pleasure doing it, you, as a social animal, cannot find it appropriate, because you leave people without food, for instance. Okay, so the reason has this whole of the role, of equilibrating, of balancing your desires in order to meet the needs of social life, of the communitarian life. And you have only the reason to do this. You have no other power to do this task. And if we are not educated, we cannot use reason properly. That's why the Stoics stresses so much about learning logic, about training your thought, because otherwise you cannot do anything good. You cannot equilibrate. You cannot balance your desires.
Yeah, that's really, it is such a complex thing to kind of figure out, right? But I've just been wondering for so long, like, it just doesn't make sense to just stop at saying, well, rationality, that's your gift, that's your key towards acting more virtuously. And this, Kai, is kind of, where we might say that the theology of Stoicism comes into the game. It's like, okay, once you get to rationality, you need to go beyond that and say, well, where does the good come from? What is the good? How do you figure that out? And it is a very complicated thing, which I think we're all trying to figure out.
In other words, reason for us is a capacity. Not just a gift, but also a capacity that you must develop, as the capacity of walking. If you do not train, if you do not walk, you lose this capacity. Same thing with our reason. And it's not an easy task to train reason, to develop reason. Basically, Stoicism is a way to develop your reason to face these challenges of social life and the life in the cosmos. It's not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like that, this idea of it being something that you develop, obviously. And we all instinctually know that you don't just have rationality and you're going to be perfect and act perfectly all the time. The reason we know that is because we don't act perfectly all the time, even though we think we have rationality. But it helps to see it as something that you can develop over time. And I think that's what the Stoics were obviously aiming at, right? They were trying to gain a deeper connection, respect, and awareness of their rationality and their ability to decipher what is wrong and what is right. And
for instance,
go on.
That's why logic is so important for them, because without studying logic, you give assent to sophisms, and giving assent to sophisms leads you to have a false vision of the world, and act in a bad way also. That's why it's so important, for instance, for them to study sophisms in order to do not give assent to them. As we see nowadays in politics and in our personal lives. So it's a very important thing to know. In Stoicism, virtue is knowledge, and knowledge is virtue.
Yeah.
So when you know something, this knowledge leads you to a good action. And if you do not know, this absence of knowledge, you lead you to a bad action.
Yeah, and this is what's so I guess beneficial and also challenging about the time that we live in, is that there is so much information out there. There's so much knowledge out there, right? And so it's a pretty daunting task. And you think, well, on the one hand, it offers a massive opportunity, but on the other hand, you could put up pretty much any, problem to solve for humanity, and both sides will find some information that supports that their way of doing things is the better way of doing things, right? And so, like you said, going back to logic, that's the study of, okay, well, which side is right? Let's decipher their arguments. Let's try and not fall for for sophism, as you said. Let's try and get to the bottom of this question. And I wanted to ask something of both of you, because there's actually this. I want to read this quote here. Actually, I'm going to grab this out. This is a quote that you cited in your article, and it was from Epictetus in the Enchiridion. And I highlighted this ages ago, and when I read this in your article, I was like, damn, that's such a great quote that we all need to listen to. And I want to have a discussion about this. But he says, if you decide to do something, don't shrink from being seen doing it, even if the majority of people disapprove. If you're wrong to do it, then you should shrink from doing it altogether. But if you're right, then why worry about how people will judge you? And this kind of aligns with something that I've been thinking lately, which is that we really need at least one or many Socrates in our time right now, right? Socrates was the person who came along and said, you know what, no matter what your laws are, you tyrants, I'm going to live how I think is correct, what I think is virtuous. And yeah, like, you can sentence me to death, but at the end of the day, he wasn't one to shirk from doing what he thought was right? And so we need to take that attitude on today, especially with, like you say, there's governments all around the world doing terrible things, polluting the earth, civil unrest. There's terrible things going on everywhere. We need to have a little bit of that. Well, once I know what is right, I'm going to do it no matter what, and I'm not going to worry about what people think of me. how do you think you get to that stage where you have the confidence to be able to do things that are right despite the public opinion saying that it's wrong, or the public opinion not approving of your decisions? What is the process to get to that stage?
Please, Kai.
Yeah, I'll chuck it over to Kai.
Well, I think that it's not something that you do at a certain point. I think you constantly do it. You're constantly checking yourself, right? You're constantly, because you want to be pro-social as a Stoic, so you don't want to upset people's feelings unnecessarily, right? It's not about it's not that, because feelings are not bad, they're indifferent. So I'm like, do I want to upset my uncle's feelings unnecessarily? Like that, his feeling is not necessarily a bad thing. So as a Stoic, it's like, well, actually, I don't want to unnecessarily upset anybody because there's no need to. So you're constantly in that balance of like, what is the correct course of action? And in an ideal world, it's very simple, but in the practice, it's like there's so many. When I look at justice, is how I speak to somebody, what words I use to correct them. Where they're at, how can I be as fair to them as I can be based on the fact they're 5 years old, or the fact that they're a new Stoic, or the fact that they're 29 years old but they've never read a book before, so they've only read one book and so they think that that's the book. How can I correct them? So there's a whole lot of concepts we have to manage. It's not just like, okay, I know, for example, that throwing rubbish out the window is bad. I know that's bad because of the reasons Aldo just told me. However, the person that I'm educating, they might not know that. And to be fair to them, I have to try to be like, okay, why are they doing that? And what is the best way to talk to them about this? Because that's also about being fair, right? I can't just launch into an academic discussion with somebody about why they shouldn't throw something out the window. Even if I know that's the reason, if I can give you evidence, sometimes you have to break it down to somebody and you have to be fair to them and you not give them the benefit of the doubt. I wouldn't go that far, but certainly try to see from their perspective why they're doing something. And they might be like, well, I don't care. And then you can correct them. And they might say, well, I didn't realize it was wrong. I'm giving literally, I've heard this in Latin America, I'm giving somebody a job. If I throw something out the window, I'm giving a person a job. So I'm doing them a favor. I have, honestly, in Colombia, I heard that quite often. So then you say, well, actually, that's a really good place that person's coming from. They're actually thinking about giving somebody a job. They don't think that maybe that person could do something else. They think that there's another job that person could do. So then you start to understand that you're looking at it from their perspective. I'm not asking, it's not empathizing. We don't agree with empathizing, but certainly sympathizing with them, trying to understand at least why they are reasoning the way they are based on a discussion. So you're not trying to be them or think like them. You're just literally asking them why. And I think that we're just not doing that in society. We're not asking a debate. Even something you just said about who is right. It might be that somebody has some right here on the left, for example, and some right on the right. So it's not even deciding who's right. It's which part of the argument is correct. So not the person. We don't judge the left wing or the right wing or the green chariots versus the red chariots. They're more correct. It's more like which part of your argument is correct and which part is not correct. And that's difficult because then you're always going to be in that middle where you're not pleasing the left, for example, or the right, or the red chariot team and on the green chariot team. You're actually just saying, I'm interested in what is reasonable, regardless of who says it. So it is a very unpopular position to be in. I do think at the moment at least, and it will change. I think the academic community or at least the authors in contemporary Stoicism, we have a bigger responsibility, we have a bigger obligation. And my concern is that if you have contemporary Stoics writing about individual pursuits, is the kind of people that you attract to Stoicism are individualistic. So I would argue perhaps with Aldo, or Disgust, I should say, so perhaps the reason why the Brazilian community was social, pro-social, communitarianism was a pro-social way of thinking about the world, is because the people that were doing the movement were pro-social and they wanted to build a community and they wanted to disseminate information for the good of the community. Because the roots of the Brazilian tree was being watered by communal desires. What sprung up was a Stoicism that was communal. And you can see that is changing a little bit in Brazil because they're reading English contemporary Stoic stuff, and you're getting in these people who have no interest. And I'm sorry to say that about Brazil. It's sad because they have this hasn't been the case, but now because there's like this translations into Portuguese of contemporary Stoic material, and I don't know how, I'll emphasize the word contemporary rather than Stoic, you're getting a whole load of people interested in quote unquote Stoicism that don't share Aldo's waters, like they've been watered by this communal sense. So I would say the reason why Brazil was communal was because the leaders were communal. So the people that I attract to Stoicism are the people, in my case, are people interested in the planet and the environment. And the people that I don't attract so much are the people interested in, I don't know, stocks and shares, because I don't write about those things. Not that they're wrong, but I don't write about how you could apply that to the Stoic framework. So you can really see we are who we attract as well. So if Stoicism is becoming selfish and individualistic, which it is, even in Brazil, unfortunately, increasingly so, that's a poor reflection, a very poor reflection on the English-speaking Stoic world. It really, the trade books and the commercial material, not the academic material. And then you start to see, wait a minute, we need to be very careful what Stoicism, what framing we give Stoicism, and what we focus on. So that to me is like something that's very sort of inherent to me that we have to solve, we have to really grapple with.
Yeah. Kai is talking a very important thing. Recently, we founded a Facebook group. It was not founded by me, but they invited me to coordinate the group. By now, it has something about 4,000 people in it. And I was shocked about some approaches of Stoicism that came from Europe and United States. For instance, the red pill. I could not believe someone was using Stoicism for this purpose. I came in contact with it with Kelly Rudolph, a friend of English friend. No, she's American, but she lives in England, a friend of mine. And I was shocked. How can someone use Stoicism as a weapon against women? It's unthinkable. And I realized that a lot of Brazilians were following it. And I decided that it was unacceptable. So I started to fight back. As you asked first, once you realize that you must do something, you must do it regardless if the people you like it or not. So we started to fight back, and we realized also that these red pill guys were linked with fascism. How do you say fascism? Fascism. So we have no other thing to do than fighting back and showing our position. Otherwise, Stoicism will be destroyed in Brazil. It will not be a good thing anymore to the society, but it will be a venom thing. You know that in Brazil is a very sexist country. You don't need a red pill to deteriorate even more the situation. Yeah, it's awful. Stoicism has this very good aspect also, talking about the equality among sexes. You know, the famous Mussolini's discourses about women, that they should be educated in the same way as men, and etc. And it's a good thing for us. It's not something that Brazilians practice, in fact. Violence against women in Brazil is terrible. Sexism is terrible. So we don't need a red pill to make things worse. So we decided, me in first place, and I told the others to do the same thing, to fight back, to showing what is for us the real Stoicism, which is this communitarian Stoicism, which is the Stoicism that talks about the equality of sexes, which is the Stoicism that talks about fraternity. of mankind, of humankind. So basically, when you decide that something with your reason, as Kay said, that you should do something, and you perceive that it's a better thing to do, you must do regardless of what other people will think about it. And as you said, it's a very Socratic thing to do.
And this is an important point to really push out there, is that through an individualistic framework, the Stoic indifference can actually go down a pretty bad path, which is like, well, I focus on myself, and what they think, that's none of my business. What they think, what they do, it's none of my business, which is true in one sense. But at the same time, if you bring the communitarianism into it, it is my business, but only once I have learned to decipher what is good and what is bad. Once you've learned that, once you feel as though you're in a point where you can rationally make a good logical argument for why somebody is acting incorrectly, especially for the good of the community, you have a responsibility, right? Do you think that we have a responsibility as Stoics to speak up when we see injustice, if we have first deciphered and deliberated, yes, this is a bad action that they're doing?
Yeah, I see in Stoicism 3 levels of reality. The first level is our personal level, the level of our reason. We thinking about inside yourselves, so to say. The second level is the social level, the other people which we make contact every day. We cannot change their ideas about things because it's up to them. But we can try to persuade them. It's our task. We cannot, for instance, if you say a lot of Nazis doing a manifestation in front of your door, you cannot lock yourself inside and say, oh, it's not up to me. It's not Stoic. As Epictetus talks about this in his Discourse, in book 2, the Discourse 5 and 6. He says, external things are indifferent, but the use of them is not indifferent. External things are the material for our choice. Without the external things, we cannot be virtuous. We only can be virtuous if we work on these external things. They don't have a value by themselves, but the use of them make all the difference. That's why I have a virtue, to make a good use of external things, or as Epictetus says, to make a good use of presentations, of fantasiae.
Of impressions, yeah.
So you have to be aware that you cannot change the idea of the others, but you must try to persuade them to think about what is the best thing to do, what is the best thing for you. So if you see a lot of fascists, of Nazis, or
fascists or Nazis,
social groups making propaganda, you cannot be in silence and say, oh, I don't care. It's not up to me. I'm Stoic. It's not up to me. I will be locked in my room. It's not Stoic at all. It's a coward action.
Yeah, it's a coward.
Yeah, so that's it. Courage. Sometimes you need more courage.
Yes. Repeating, you must be aware that you cannot change what they think. But at least you must try. The best example of this is Musonius again. When Marcus Antonius Primus was invading Rome in 20th of December of 69, he stood in front of the soldiers and said, please, don't go. Let's think about peace. Let's put the arms down. he was not successful, but he did what he could. At some point, the soldier said, Musonius, if you if you don't go out, we'll kill you. And he thought, I did what I could. But he did something. He was not just assisting the soldiers entering home. You know that it was a terrible invasion. Thousands of Romans died by the hands of their own fellow citizens. But at least he did something. And we must do something when we see injustice, when we see terrible things being doing or being said. It's the Stoic point of view. You cannot just assist as if it was not with you. It's as if it is not your problem. It's your problem because it happens in your society, in the face of earth. So it's your problem also.
Yeah. And, I think what's really important for people to realize is that it is your problem when you are at the stage where you can absolutely when you know for sure, when you've logically worked it out, yes, it's the wrong thing to do. We need to fix this. That's when it becomes your responsibility. But, I probably, like many people listening to this, am well aware of the many circumstances where I have learnt a new idea, and then all of a sudden I think that somebody else is doing something wrong, and I go and point it out to them. And then because I only know this much when there's actually this much to know, I just fall on my face, right? And it's like the ego jumps in there and tells you on every step of the journey, yeah, you're smart enough to point out their flaws. You're smart enough when really you should be focused on your own flaws, try to figure yourself out first, and then try to solve the family or the community or the country. But it's so important for people to really be aware of the power that your ego has over you. Because if you go out there and try to change society, but you haven't figured your own self out, it's going to go terribly for you. But, Aldo, I want to ask you one more question. Probably more on a personal note. So, you've obviously been a pioneer bringing Epictetus to the Portuguese language, 50,000 people reading it already, millions of people around the world who this could open it up to. What is your ideal outcome? What would you love to see happen as a result of the spreading of Stoicism throughout South America and around the world in the Portuguese language? What would you love for people to take from it, and how do you want the world to change as a result?
Well, in the first place, we intended to create in Brazil a community of researchers of Epictetus. We made it. It's done. And I hope that the next generation will increase it, and more researchers will appear and study Epictetus and spread his thought. In the second place, as you said, and it was something I was talking yesterday with David Fiedler. In Stoicism, you have 3 points. First, inner peace. As you said, you cannot try to change the world and lose your peace. You achieve nothing for you and for anyone else. In the first place, you must achieve inner peace. In the second place, you must try as much as you can to act in a communitarian way. And it is made in a lot of different ways. For instance, if you are a physician, you can reserve a part of your time to help poor people. I give an example of my childhood. The physician of our family used to reserve the mornings to attend people who could not pay. And in the afternoons, he used to attend people who could pay. So he divided his time helping both people who could pay and people who could not pay. And so acting in a communitarian way does not mean necessarily be an activist, but doing well what you know how to do. If you're a physician, you try to use this knowledge socially. If you are a lawyer, same thing, and so on. And eventually you can also be in a manifestation, as I present in London last year, the greatest manifestation. It was very beautiful.
Protest.
Protest. And in the third place, what for me is the most important thing is the thing that we are missing in the world, as both Martin Luther King and Gandhi realized, to develop this sense of fraternity among humankind. Is something that is obviously missing. The ancient Stoics realized that it's not an easy task. It's not natural to establish these bonds among cultures, because by our natural impulse, we tend to be emotionally attached to people that are like us, to people that speak the same language as us, to people that live in our country. But especially now that the world is becoming one thing, we must develop this sense of fraternity. Without this, we will lose the battle, both to save the world and to save the humankind. And it only can be achieved through philosophy. I can't see it being by religion. Religion does not do it. Religion divides people. It's my personal. I think this. Religion divides people. Religion do not congregate people. But philosophy can do it, as we are doing now. You are in Australia, isn't it? Kate is Lisbon. Are you in Lisbon by now?
Portugal. Yeah.
In Portugal. And I am in Brazil. And we are having this conversation, and we have a lot of ideas in common. Could we talk about, could we have this conversation in another situation? I cannot see it. So Stoicism is doing it already. So it's, I think this is the great gift of Stoicism, to give to the humans the opportunity to develop a sense of fraternity, and also to develop a sense of love for nature, for the cosmos.
I love that. Aldo, I want to thank you so much. I mean, I want to share with you, when I first started doing this podcast, when I first started learning about Stoicism, I definitely had that very individualistic view of it, and I felt as though the most important thing about Stoicism was the aspect of looking at your most inner recesses of your mind to try and really connect with what is uniquely you, right? And that's a massive part of Stoicism. But over the past few months, since starting the podcast again for a new direction and really trying to understand the philosophy, I've come to understand that focus inwardly on your own mind only works in the framework of Stoicism if you also focus on the vastness of your connection to everything. You need to view everything and how you play a role in that, as well as your own self and how you play a role in that. And, I want to make a commitment to you as well. And, going forward in this show, one of my big focuses is getting people to see just how important it is